Good morning, everybody. My name is Stan Hill. I'm with the Resource Conservation District of Greater San Diego County. And you've all invited yourselves here today for what we're calling GSOB, Goldspotted Oak Borer Management Solutions, Lessons Learned from 10 Years on the Front Lines. So the kind of focus of this particular webinar here is solutions, things that have worked from the experts, from Forest Service entomologist Stacy Hishinuma that's on with us today, Dr. Tom Scott, Bret Hutchinson, who's an arborist, been doing a lot of work over the last 10 plus years in a lot of locations around San Diego County. So this is not necessarily what we would call GSOB 101. There's a lot of we have resources, and there's a lot of resources for people that are, if you just need the basics or you're just getting started on your GSOB learning journey. So this is kind of next level here for solutions. Really want to highlight things that have been done and things that are working here. So we'll put there'll be some links in the chat for the video. We have a video that goes in, that's GSOB 101, that talks about the life cycle and where it came from and that kind of thing. Also, as far as questions for today, we have a lot of people, which is really great. I really appreciate everybody coming on this morning. If you have questions, as these guys are going through their presentations, if you have questions, put those in the chat. And if you can, if it's for a specific person, Tom, Bret, Stacy, address them. Just put, for Tom, and then write your question. And then when we get to the end, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll pick out some of those questions. And then when we're done, what I will do is all of those questions that people put in that chat, I will sort them by the person, get them to that person, and have them answer them at their leisure and get back to you. So we want to, we will have Q&A at the end, but I know that, we're most likely not going to be able to answer all the questions. So we just want to make sure that we address that. And yeah. Let's see. So that's kind of the introduction. So what I'd like to do here is hand it over to Chris Murphy, who's been one of our, we'll call him a neighborhood champion for a long time out at a place called Oak Grove that some of you may be familiar with. But yeah, it's been kind of I wouldn't call it ground zero, but it's probably one of the multiple ground zeros in San Diego County over time. So if you are ready, Chris, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Stan. The agenda today is Stan outlined. We're going to hear from Bret, then Dr. Tom, then Dr. Stacy, do a little wrap up, and then go to the Q&A. So first of all, thank you all you guys for being here. Thank Stan, and thanks to Ann Baldridge and Heather Katie from the whole group at RCD of Greater San Diego. Along with the state of California, you were a great partner to Oak Grove in our GSOB fight. We also want to acknowledge our Forest Service partners who have been in the fight since we found Oak Grove on their Oak Grove lands. Scientists like Forester Andrew Weinhardt and entomologist Stacy Hishinuma, who's on our panel today, have been very proactive and responsive. And thank everybody for joining us today. We have a lot of landowners and managers here, including our Oak Grove neighbors who have been with us in the fight. So for a little background on Oak Grove, first of all, in the news this week, this is yesterday's LA Times. A lot of you guys probably know this, but the bug is on the move. And so today's meeting, I think, is very timely. I hope that we can give some of you folks who are just starting to fight some good information to take up the battle here. So, some background on our little Oak Grove community. I think actually the elevation in this slide is accurate. I think the population number there is exaggerated. I don't think there's actually 100 people. There's definitely over 100 bugs that have been in Oak Grove, but maybe not 100 people. So, Oak Grove is just a small community, backcountry community. We've got an oak woodland of mature trees. We're at the headwaters of Santa Margarita watershed on the north slope of Palomar. adjacent to the Cleveland National Forest. And this is where the wild things still run. This is habitat. This is critical habitat to California's ecology. So saving these trees is essential to stop wildfire risk, to minimize carbon, and to preserve the backbone of our ecosystem. To put the bottom line at the top here, we got ahead of it. We've been on the lookout for GSOB since 2009. My girl Barbara Booth has been a leader in this. She's the one who pulled Tom Coleman into it. She found Dr. Tom and Bret Hutchinson, and as a result, we were able to detect an early infestation in 2015. We engaged everybody, and we've been working with what we find are some of the top field scientists. We've developed effective strategies and solutions, and we just recently completed the 10th annual survey of oak trees, and that's really key to the success of what we've seen. So the Oak Grove Project is unique. It's a proof of concept, and so really we've become, I believe, a laboratory for research. We've developed we've shared information with other folks, and this project delivers on the California's climate initiatives, which is important. And the bottom line here really is the bottom line. We believe we've found a way to save the most trees at the least cost. So what we've learned are really, we're not going to realistically eradicate GSOB, but we think we can manage it. And that's all about monitoring with surveys. So our trees today are healthy all these years later, whereas throughout San Diego and heading northward, woodlands have been just decimated. So we're still learning. Just recently, our last survey, Bret was able to discover a technique for finding first-year infections of trees that have not been treated for several years. This is a first. And so there's more lessons to in the coming years. We're trying to share what we've learned. Stan mentioned the Fighting GSOB video that we produced, and then we're continuing to do educational events like today's. So we've had the good fortune of finding the right people. For over 10 years, each time I hike in the woodlands with Dr. Tom Scott and Bret Hutchinson, I learn from two brilliant scientists. And I think you'll learn from them today and Dr. Stacy Hishinuma. Bret Hutchinson is our field general in our effort to fight them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bret Hutchinson.
I'd like to start by thanking everybody for joining today, and hopefully we can pass on some information that's going to help people make some wise decisions on how they treat their problems in their forests. I'll be covering a lot of information today, a lot of different topics. Some aren't directly related to GSOB, but they're things that have to do with forest health and management, and it's important to understand that bigger picture. To introduce myself, again, I'm Bret Hutchinson. I'm the owner of Green Tree Forest Service. I'm an ISA certified arborist. I have a degree in environmental toxicology from UC Davis. I am a current QAL holder with a restricted use permit for carbaryl products, and I've been working in the local forest for about 35 years now. And my involvement with all this started about 15 years ago now, when I met Dr. Scott when the UC Riverside was initially starting some of their early GSOB studies in the San Diego area. And my company was directly used to go out in the forest and provide the logistics for sampling and recovering samples and electronic data for all the locations that Riverside wanted any information from. So we did a lot of traveling all over the county, saw a lot of different locations and different things that were going on all around. So that then moved into collecting other types of samples, whatever they basically needed us to do related to their studies. We tried to provide the logistics, and that turned into some of the early insecticide tests where they were screening different types of compounds to determine which one had some promise for controlling the GSOB activity. Those early insecticide tests then were refined further, where eventually We did a scaled up test where we were studying carbaryl specifically as a barrier spray. And those tests required us to go out and harvest very specific types of material that had high levels of activity in it so that we would, see the results we needed from a statistical standpoint from the beetles that we were studying. So samples were collected, pieces were identified and processed and broken down and sealed. And these types of samples you see here were the result of that process of selecting material in the forest that we knew would work properly for our study. That material was then put into barrels, both control barrels and treated barrels. The control barrels obviously were clean with no spray, and the treated barrels were originally sprayed, I believe, at a 2% concentration of carbaryl. And from there, we monitored those barrels and collected a whole variety of different insects, obviously, from our control barrels. Everything from parasitic wasps to clearwing moths, other flathead borers. There's a picture of the wasp there. Snake flies, green metallic beetles, just big as a whole host of different insects we collected in the control barrels, and obviously a lot of GSOB. Our original control barrels, the average collection of GSOB was about 43 beetles per barrel. And then in the treated barrels, out of 16 total barrels, we only found 2 finished GSOB, and those didn't even make it up into the traps. They were found in the bottom of the barrels once we cleaned out the material at the end of the study. And so we obviously knew that things were working. So the treated barrels, we then took those out and scrutinized them for anything we could find. And one thing that we initially found right away were these very small, little irregular openings, roughly around 1 millimeter or so. And these are openings that we did not see previously when we inspected the pieces before they went into the chambers. And with a little bit of extra relief, we were able to go down and dig down into that opening, and this is what we saw staring back at us, a dead GSOB. And we continued to dissect more of these types of lesions and actually opened up the chambers, and we came up with a very common theme here, and it was that of a GSOB that had just reached the surface, just reached the surface of the bark, about to chew its way out, and it's dead. And that we dissected many chambers, and it was a common theme throughout. Lots of dead beetles that had just reached the surface and didn't get any further. And one thing you can notice in this picture is this GSOB is digging its way out through its own frass. And what I mean by that is when the larva first sets up its chamber for pupation, it has already created the exit hole, or not the exit hole, but the exit tunnel up to the surface. Here in this picture, you can see a completely finished, this is actually a live GSOB here. This one was the one that was killed, but this GSOB, if you see ahead of it right here, this whole tunnel is already packed with frass. But the hole to the surface is most likely all the way through. And that's a hole that this wasp right here, is a parasitic wasp, finds those holes and lays an egg in there and to consume the GSOB larva. So when the beetle goes to exit, it has to make its way through all this frass, and it's moving that material past its body. And then when it gets to the surface and it's chewing the surface, it's still not directly feeding on this material, but it's digging its way out. So it's fluffing up the carbaryl and moving it along its body, which obviously then it's going to inhale into its sphericals, the little holes that the beetles breathe through along its body, and obviously it leads to some really good mortality. So on the heels of those successful barrel tests, we then moved into the field and did in situ tests where we found trees that had the right level of activity. We screened them in. Actually, we sprayed one zone. We sprayed, and then we screened them in with metal window screen in order to catch the beetles over the next fly period. And we basically came up with almost identical results as what we found in the barrels, where the treated sections had almost zero. It wasn't 100% zero. We had two trees that had zero. We had one tree that had a low level of emergence that actually came out, but it was very low. And that was this particular tree. And we kind of chalked that up to the fact that we had a difficult time treating certain parts of the bolt that we needed for that test. So while all this was going on, and we were learning all those kinds of information from the pesticide studies, we were Tom Scott and I were seeing that there was things going on, and we decided to start reaching out to the communities around the county, and we were putting on public seminars to try to educate anybody that wanted to listen, to inform them on what was going on and some of our earliest information that we had in order to identify things and of that nature. And Chris and Barbara of Oak Grove happened to learn about what we were talking about, and they originally called us one year around 2014, I would say it was, and they had a neighbor's tree that was looking kind of funny. So Tom and I came out there to take a peek at it, and initially we didn't find any signs of GSOB. It was just specifically a tree that was very old and kind of on its way out for a lot of other reasons not related to GSOB. So a year went by, and then at the end of that year, I got another call from Chris and Barbara. This time, however, they had a patch of trees near one of their property lines that trees were actually actively dying and turning. This picture you see right here shows the hot spot that was popping up at that time. You can see some of the canopies turning brown. So we went back out there again, did more inspections on these trees that were dying. And again, we didn't find any immediate signs of GSOB. The trees were definitely dying and dead. And so we started the process of just removing those and figuring out what was going on. And right away, when we cut those trees down, we realized that they were most likely suffering from severe drought stress. And they had all the trees that we cut down had high levels of the Western oak bark beetle actually in the upper canopy and attacking the tree in that nature. And unless you're not familiar with the Western oak bark beetle, we'll go over that one super quick just to bring people up to speed. Western oak bark beetle is a native beetle. It's been here for centuries, more than likely. It's a very teeny little bark borer, about 2 millimeters long. And it starts its life cycle. It generally attacks drought-stressed trees specifically, and trees that are in that type of condition. So the process starts with the actual beetle itself boring into the tree, and male and female mate. And the picture on the left here is an entry hole that we were studying in a black oak tree, California black oak. This is a green tree. These beetles like to attack green trees that are in drought stress. And when they bore in, then right inside this hole, there's usually a small T-shaped junction. And right where this junction is, that's where the female lays this packet of eggs that you see to the right. The female will lay anywhere from 20 to 30 eggs all in one little spot. And when those eggs hatch, the larvae fan out and literally consume almost everything underneath the bark, right in the cambium layer. And the biggest detriment that this beetle has is UC Riverside determined 8 or 10 years ago now that the Western oak bark beetle transmits at least one, possibly more types of fungus. And as soon as the beetle activity begins, that fungus begins its activity. In this picture here, you see where the fungus has penetrated down in the xylem, where the tree tries to move water up. And ultimately, that will, sorry, I went too far. That that process continues until the entire xylem is completely shut down and the tree can't move any water. And then you wind up with a tree that turns completely brown very rapidly. The tree will turn brown within a matter of a month sometimes. And that's usually the culmination of the Western oak bark beetle activity. And like I said, again, that beetle likes to attack drought-stressed trees. So when we look back to what was going on Oak Grove at that time, um, everybody's wondering, well, why are these trees that are down in an area that normally has shallow groundwater, the areas where these trees were dying, in some years there's flowing water in the creek right next door, and that tells you that the groundwater aquifer is very shallow on your average year. But during this period, there was about 5 years you see circled here where there was unusually low rainfall. So those trees were most likely going into drought. And when you see a big tree that's sitting in what's normally a wet area, and when you think about it going in drought, you kind of wonder, well, how is that? And a quick explanation of that is from this slide. When you have shallow groundwater, you see off to the right here, you see standing puddled water. That is basically the static level of the water table in the specific region. And below that, there is complete saturation. But above that, there's this area called the vadose zone. And the vadose zone is an area of it's not completely saturated. There's pore space and vapor transfers going on, oxygen, carbon dioxide, everything goes back and forth. And that's the area that most trees and roots will prefer to get the majority of their water. And if you see in this picture, these areas I've circled, you can see where trees and plants have put water right down into this zone. And then the roots branch off in all directions because the plant knows that this is the best place to have a continuous water source, sometimes year round. But what this does, it sets up large trees for failure when you have years of consistently bad rain. Because what will happen is this zone that the tree is used to having continuous water and can deal with, hot conditions or other conditions and has plenty of water to drop. When that water for a couple of years suddenly drops much deeper than it normally averages, the tree can't keep up. It can't grow enough roots fast enough to follow the water down. So then if the tree has a large amount of canopy, it's going to put an unusual demand on the vadose zone, which is now going dry because the water table is dropping. And that will put these large trees into immediate severe drought stress. And at that point, they can be easily attacked by the Western oak bark beetle. So that all being said, we were assuming that was what was going on at Chris's property, and we started exploring other properties nearby, and we had permission to go on our neighbor's property and see what was going on there. And so with just a little bit of exploration, we found high levels of GSOB only a few hundred yards from Chris's property. We had full-blown amplifying trees, trees that were dying all over the place, lots of signs of major GSOB, and a whole variety of activity going on there. So Chris and Barbara decided to go into full-blown, mode of mapping their forest. They wanted to be aware of everything that was going on there and try to stay ahead of it. So we did a comprehensive survey of their trees. We actually tagged and mapped over 500 trees that were larger than about 8 inches in diameter on their property. We did a full evaluation of health and GSOB activity. And from that initial survey, we found a total of 3 trees on their property out of over 500 that actually had direct signs of active GSOB. And from there, Chris and Barbara decided to basically, take action to start doing something about it. And obviously, the first thing we needed to do was try to motivate the public as best as possible and get as much information out there to them so residents in the area would be aware of what's coming their way and have the knowledge to understand what the subtle changes were going on in their trees in order to be able to combat whatever their problems were as soon as possible. So at the same time, Chris and Barbara had started off, and we did a small scale early insecticide test where we began some barrier spraying. We hired a professional sprayer from out of town to come in, and it's kind of a type of sprayer I call a residential sprayer. They are used to spraying, one or two trees in somebody's backyard and charging an arm and a leg to do it. And so initially the costs were kind of high, and we knew that that was going to be an issue, trying to get people to get involved and be able to afford to do what they really needed to do. So we reached out to the public, and in that way we were working with the Forest Service also, and we put on a public seminar right there in Oak Grove where through emails and word of mouth and every way we could possibly do it, we got the community together and put on this presentation to present the case of what GSOB is, where it is, and how to identify it early and give people some ideas that there may have been a route that we're going to be working with that might be able to control the beetle. From that initial meeting, we generated a lot of community interest from a pretty good percentage of the population in Oak Grove. Got permission to go out on the properties, do inspections. And so we went out to begin mapping and trying to figure out exactly where all the spots were around Oak Grove, where GSOB definitely was already going on. And then to start planning ways to start controlling that with different types of barrier spray applications. And from that, initially, we got pretty good response from the community getting involved in that spraying process. Obviously, some of our biggest drawbacks right away were, not everybody can afford this, not everybody can go out and spray all their trees. So budget was a big thing, and we had to find ways to work around everybody's budget. Some people flat out couldn't afford it at all. And so there were other community members that managed to pony up a little extra money so that we could keep chasing after hotspots and try to get some at least initial areas taken care of while mapping and trying to plan, how we're going to deal with future issues. Let's see. And so through that, we managed to meet, like I said, lots of different clients with lots of different situations. We had clients that only had one tree, and that one tree was clean of GSOB. And then we had some clients that had one tree that had GSOB, and we had other clients that had hot spots with numerous trees in one small area that had GSOB, and other areas on the property that were still clean. And then we had other clients that had full-blown infestations going with numerous amplifying trees and trees dying. So we kind of went into this knowing that we had all these different levels, and it was just a matter of trying to figure out how we were going to attack all this. And budget was obviously a very big factor. So from that, we managed to do quite a variety of years just out of the community's pocket. And then in 2021, the Resource Conservation District became involved and was interested in the process that we had going, and they wanted to understand it better and see if there was any input that they could do to help with the situation. And obviously, one of their biggest things is funding, but also public outreach. So they were able to help us reach out to more people and other ways of getting the community involved, and also the funding that they provided allowed us to reduce the costs based on whether they had a cost sharing program or whatever they were doing any specific season. So let's see. On the next one, here's a slide that shows you kind of where that change occurred. Here's the years in Oak Grove. We got clients and the number of trees sprayed. And you see in 2021, The number of trees sprayed increased significantly, not just in Oak Grove, but countywide. Countywide, it went up quite a bit because the RCD had programs going that was benefiting not just Oak Grove, but anybody that really wanted to spray. And through all that, we then were able to, because of the extra funding, we were able to take on other techniques of spraying as far as taking on large areas that had high levels of infestation and experimenting with what we call whole forest spraying, where when you have a large problem and you want to try to get it under control quick, what do? And you come in and ideally you come into those areas and you spray everything you can, including trees that are considered amplifying trees. Those are some of the most important ones to spray, even though you know those trees are most likely going to die. Your ability to knock out a couple hundred larvae that are about to pupate and come out and fly out to other trees is extremely important. So through all this process, the RCU was a big help. And then over the last few years, they've also been helping to fund our annual survey that we do each year. And our annual survey is becoming a very powerful tool for continued monitoring of where problems are. And it gives us the ability to plan, new areas of where we need to spray and what we might need to do to, keep up with the spread of the beetle. Also through all this, we had clients that sprayed for a few years, and then we eradicated their GSOB problem. And then for budget reasons, they decided to stop. And then within a couple of years, we've seen GSOB return to those same trees. And that was because of a nearby neighbor that had never gotten on the program, so to speak, and still had hot trees that were pumping out beetles, and they came right back to the areas within a couple of years after the client had stopped spraying. So obviously, the finding GSOB early is a very important thing to do, and keeping up on how you're going to treat it quickly and figuring out what you're going to do is a very important thing to do. Trees that have GSOB are not necessarily a write-off completely. We have seen evidence where trees that have even moderate GSOB have survived and can repair damage and eventually recover. That's not always the case, though, but it does happen. And obviously, trees with zero GSOB, we're found is very easy to keep GSOB from even starting in those trees. So when we're talking about how to be efficient, the most important thing, obviously, is recognizing GSOB early, understanding the early signs of what causes the GSOB to spread around. And some of the quickest and simplest ways of finding GSOB is just simply through satellite imagery. Here's some pictures of some properties where in 2012, you see this group of trees that looks nice and fairly healthy anyway, it appears anyway from the satellite. But then within 2 years, 2014, you see crown thinning starting and some changes going on in that forest. And this particular area was not in the budget, so to speak, to spray the first few years. So GSOB was allowed to do what it wants here for quite a few years. And here's your result. Here's the 2012 picture, and here's 2025. You can see lost way more than half of the largest trees were completely wiped out. And some of that probably could have been prevented with early treatment, but some trees, if they're significantly infested, you're not going to be able to save them. And but controlling the beetle by barrier spray in those trees is still important to keep that population down. Here's another image of a hotspot that we found just by satellite search. When these trees die and turn completely brown, that's obviously a major indication that something wrong is going into that part of the forest. We found this hotspot, went out and inspected it, and we found 2 trees that were at amplifying levels, plus another 8 or 10 trees that had lower levels of GSOB. So the client decided to spray pretty much this entire area in order to get ahead of the problem. And that was just started 2 years ago now in this particular region. So early identification is king, and that's very important in staying ahead of these things before it gets too out of hand again. So when we talk about some of the early symptoms that you're looking for, canopy thinning is one of the easiest ones to notice right away from a distance. But we have to understand the process of canopy thinning, and I'll cover that briefly just so you understand what that means. Canopy thinning is a condition that happens in most trees, and it's usually a direct relation to drought stress, meaning especially in like this tree, this is the coast live oak, canopy thinning generally appears in these trees in the late fall, and meaning trees without GSOB. Let's clarify that. Normal canopy thinning that's induced by drought stress is generally obvious in the late fall, and that's a result of a variety of factors, meaning usually it starts with the previous winter, you have a poor amount of rainfall, and then the next summer you have unusually hot temperatures. Maybe you've got conditions over 100 degrees for a month straight that may be abnormal or even more. And strong Santa Ana winds come in September. All those factors lead to the root zone drying out rapidly. And when the root zone dries out rapidly, the tree's root system sends abscisic acid up the system, and abscisic acid causes the older leaves of a tree to abscess or fall off the tree. And generally in the fall, that is obvious by what you see as what I call a peppering of dead leaves, where you don't have clumps of dead leaves, you don't have large branches dying, you have just singular leaves that are turning brown, or going through the process of turning brown and falling off the tree, and then you're left with a tree with a much thinner canopy. That type of process, though, if it continues and it is directly related to drought stress, meaning rainfall and other issues like that, it will continue down a spiral, and the canopy will continue thinning until the tree gets to the right level of drought stress, where it can be attacked by the western oak bark beetle and killed very quickly. Now, GSOB comes in because GSOB's activity starts in the lower trunk, and that feeding of the larva on the cambium layer causes a complete disruption of the tree's ability to move carbohydrates and sugars down through the layer called the phloem, which is out one of the layers in the cambium. And the phloem is where the tree feeds itself, if you will. The sugars and carbohydrates and photosynthate that's made up in the canopy is sent down through the phloem all the way down to the roots to feed the roots. So when that process is disrupted, the tree can no longer move food down to feed the roots. So the immediate effect is your roots begin to fail. The roots begin to starve. They fail to seek out new areas and resources, and they literally slow down their ability to move nutrients and water up the tree. So you wind up with a tree that goes into sort of like an artificial drought stress, if you will, because it can't move. The roots just aren't working and doing what they're supposed to do anymore. And then the tree then is in this drought stress condition, and that can continue downhill year after year as the roots starve further and further. And then eventually the tree will be at a position where the western oak bark beetle will attack and finish the tree off, and the whole thing dies very quickly. So that's canopy thinning, and it's a like I said, a condition that progresses, and with GSOB, it is just exacerbated, where if you have GSOB activity in your tree and you decide to try to do something about it, meaning, whether you're doing a systemic insecticides or other processes, the root systems aren't working and the tree's not moving, material up its column very well. So treatment of those trees is difficult. Even if you think your tree is in drought stress and you decide to try to hydrate the tree, that is usually also unsuccessful, and so is winter rains, where your tree's roots just aren't working. So it'll stay in a drought stress condition and keep going downhill literally until you do something else to either halt that larva activity and get it to the point where the tree tries to repair the damage, which trees can do that, but they have to have enough resources to do that. And crown thinning is obvious in lots of different types of trees. Obviously, there's the coast live oak, but you'll see the same process in canyon live oaks. Here's some California black oaks that are showing serious canopy thinning. When black oak trees tend to go into drought stress in the late fall, if it's really bad, the parts of the tree will turn completely brown rather than going to their usual fall, color transformation. And when parts of those trees, the black oaks meaning, turn completely brown, those areas are usually completely dead. And the next year, they won't even leaf out, and those areas will then be attacked by western oak bark beetle. It'll finish off any moisture, and the same process continues downhill as far as the tree getting weaker and weaker, and then eventually dying. So that's canopy thinning. Obviously, the next thing, if you see trees with canopy thinning and you decide to go up and inspect them to determine what's going on, the first thing you're going to be looking for are exit holes. That's the easiest, quickest thing to identify from GSOB, and finding the correct exit holes are important, because obviously there's lots of different insects out there. They're all making different kinds of holes, round ones, oval ones, big ones, small ones, and you got to make sure you identify the correct hole. There's quite a few times I've been called out to confirm a GSOB identification, and I find that somebody has just misdiagnosed some entry holes. So it's the type of holes you find and how many you find in an area that'll tell you whether or not you have significant GSOB activity. And there's some other different types of exit holes you can see here. That's why you got to really make sure you know what you're looking at and don't misdiagnose something and call something that it's not. Next sign you find frequently, especially even on trees that are early in their level of infestation, is woodpecker activity. The woodpeckers in our area have figured out that at a very specific time of the year, the GSOB larva, especially in the coast live oaks, migrates out near the outer bark and digs a pupation chamber where it sits in hibernation throughout the entire winter. And our woodpeckers have figured out that process, and they know when to come and tap, tap, tap on the bark and find those chambers, and they pull the larva out and eat them. And it's very specific type of woodpecker activity. They're specifically going after these trails, the tunnels that was made by the GSOB while it's transiting out near the outer bark, looking for its place to begin hibernation. And you can also tell how old it is, the GSOB or the woodpecker activity, by the color of this area. This is a fairly fresh woodpecker engraving there, whereas this one here is a little older. So you can kind of get a relative idea on when that activity was created. And also the type of woodpecker activity is important too. Those slides we just showed, those were woodpeckers going after GSOB. These holes that you see here, these are woodpeckers going after western oak bark beetle. So you got to be able to differentiate what you're seeing to understand whether you're looking at really a GSOB attack or whether it's other things that go on within the tree system. And then we also have this type of activity, which sometimes this is from woodpeckers, but frequently this is made by sapsuckers. And sapsuckers are another type of bird similar to the woodpecker that creates these holes all the way down to the cambium layer. And it does this intentionally for two reasons. Both they ingest some of the sap, but they also feed on insects that are actually attracted to these holes that they create. The western oak bark beetle we talked about before can be attracted to wounds on trees, and that specific beetle, the western oak bark beetle, can go through up to 3 generations in our specific climate in Southern California. And so it can actually be moving. We've seen the western oak bark beetle moving in the very middle of winter, as long as the daytime temperature is up a little bit over, say, about 72 degrees. You can still have western oak bark beetle moving around, and they will try to seek out wounded trees. Even if you prune your trees, frequently the western oak bark beetle can be attracted to your pruning cuts. So it's important to stay ahead of that stuff. So then we have lesions. Lesions are the next big factor that is important for identification of both GSOB and other insects as well. These lesions you see here, these are large GSOB lesions that are directly related to the destruction that's going on both in the bark and the cambium zone, where there's large scale disruption of the phloem. And these trees will bleed heavily at certain times of the year and create these very large lesions that are easy to find, and usually you'll find exit holes on these trees by the time they're already at this level. A lot of times these are trees that are already reaching amplifying status. Here's a large tree that the right side of the tree was already completely dead. The left side was still alive. And you can see on the right side, the bark plating that goes on, these areas where you see these horizontal cracks and vertical cracks. The cambium layer underneath this area is completely dead. There's no live cambium in any of these areas. This is an area that has had most likely GSOB activity for quite a few years already. And a lot of times this area is already so dry that if you look for larvae in this area, you won't find very much. But on this side of the tree where you still have active lesions, there's still green material, you can chisel into this area and find larvae readily. So that's kind of some of the stuff you're looking for as far as lesion activity. And that's why you need to be able to identify what the differences are in lesions. This is a lesion from the Western oak bark beetle. You can see the very teeny entry hole in the very center, and the area where the tree is leaked, so to speak, and a little wet spot all the way around. And here's another Western oak bark beetle lesion. That beetle, like I said before, was found to transmit at least one different type of fungus. The one I believe that Riverside identified was a Geosmithia fungus that is responsible for what they call foamy bark canker, which is a process where if the tree is healthy enough and has good moisture, when that process begins, the exit hole will literally look like it's foaming bubbles and bubbling. And this is a site where that process was and then dried out after the activity dropped off. And here's another picture of Western oak bark beetle attack, so you can kind of see what some of those lesions look like and be able to identify those versus GSOB lesions. Next one, that's a real common lesion that you see a lot on lots of our coast live oak trees, is these that are made by the clearwing moth. The clearwing moth is just that. It's not a beetle, it's a moth, and it lays its eggs in the nooks of the outer bark, and those eggs hatch and it turns into a little caterpillar. And this little caterpillar bores down into the bark and it feeds mostly on the outer bark. It never, I won't say never, but the majority of the time it never reaches all the way down to the cambium layer. It's generally feeding on the outer bark, and it will create this roughed up looking broken up bark that tends to fall off the tree, and sometimes you'll find large round exit holes. But see at the bottom of this picture, that's where old activity, and up here at the top of the picture where these lesions are, that's where the current activity is still going on. And here's a lower picture of clearwing activity that can allow you to help identify that. That clearwing activity is one of the number one things that people sometimes misidentify as GSOB activity when they see those lesions, and sometimes the exit holes they will misidentify. So it's important to make sure you understand these things and what's what when you're staring at them. Here's a picture of the actual clearwing moth larva feeding on that inner bark, and you can see it's out here in the bark. It's not down here at the cambium layer, so that's why most of the time the tree will wall off this damage and create a new cuticle on the outside to seal off this damage, and this outer bark falls off, but you still have a good seal and the tree's intact. These red circles you see, that's the actual kind of pelletized frass that this larva makes, and you can find that specifically sometimes in piles on the outer bark where this activity is going on. And once that larva develops, it eventually pupates into this guy. It's the clearwing moth. This is a very blown up picture of it. It looks kind of like a bumblebee, but it's not. It's actually moth. Here's a little better picture of it. Is this guy right here? There's a snake fly over here, but this is about the rough size of what the clearwing moth looks like, in case anybody ever comes across it. So through these inspections and everything we've been doing for years and the observations we've made, we've come across some new findings. This year specifically, we came to find this little teeny lesion that we noticed, and we've been seeing it for a couple of years. I even specifically found a few of these on some of Chris's trees initially that we thought had died specifically by the Western oak bark beetle, but in hindsight, we found one or two of these little lesions, and I never really thought much about it back then, but because we never found any exit holes, so we didn't think those trees had GSOB. But this year specifically, we decided to finally start exploring these, and here's another picture of a lesion, and right where this red X is, that's where when we chiseled in, we found a live hibernating larva. And right now, I'm going to kick it over to Chris really quick because he's got a real short little video that we're going to watch, and that'll allow you to see this exact process of how we find these things. Okay, so this is the same tree we've already been working on, and we found another lesion right here at the tip of my finger. You see the little teeny black dot, and we're going to try to chisel this out to prove our theory even further. So here we go. Start out by chiseling right through the lesion very lightly and determine which way the tunneling may go. I want to get right down into the new material. Now we see the tunneling going that direction. So we'll go that way a little bit. Sure enough, we're following a GSOB tunnel. Still following the GSOB. Oh, nope, there it is. There's the larva right there. And we can clean that out a little better so y'all can see that. There it is. There's the new larva. The lesion was right here. Within 2 inches of the lesion, there's the hibernating larva. This tree has no exit holes. It has a canopy percentage of roughly 50%, maybe even a little bit less. It's a tree that has had canopy thinning because of its location. Geologically, it's in a rough area, lots of boulders and poor soil. But it was been sprayed previously. This tree was then skipped intentionally for 4 years. And now this is the first year in the inspection we've figured out this new technique of finding these larvae. First year, still folded, now dead. With all this information that we have from doing these inspections and looking for densities of GSOB activity, if you do some mapping and then evaluate these trees based on the level of some of those signs that you see, you can put together a map that will show you overall GSOB activity, whether I tend to just break it down into either 0 or low, medium, and high. And here you can see just a basic map of how that density can be seen, and then it can give you some ideas about how you decide to proceed with treatment. And when we talk about treatment, there's obviously plenty of options. You can do barrier sprays that if you want to try to control the beetle activity. If you have trees that are dead or near death, the recommendation is to cut them down and deal with the material as quickly as possible. And if you're keeping that material, firewood, you want to split it down to firewood size as soon as possible to begin the drying process. Cover that firewood with clear visqueen all the way down to the ground and leave it there from March all the way through September. That's going to give you the peace of mind that the wood is dried out and you've halted the majority of the activity. Brush and small material should be ideally fed through a modern high-speed chipper. Obviously, all the same material could also be either burned or buried or hauled off to a local sanitary landfill. Chipping is obviously the easiest on site to do. When I say a high-speed chipper, the reason for that is tub grinders generally, if you're running stuff through tub grinders, they can kick out material that is fairly large and can still sometimes contain live hibernating larvae. Whereas when you put material through a high-speed chipper, it's not necessarily the cutting action, it's the acceleration that kills the insects, meaning it's like a bug hitting your windshield. When it gets chopped by a high-speed chipper, it gets accelerated from 0 to about 100 miles an hour in a fraction of a second, and the beetles' bodies and larvae literally just pop like water balloons. We tested that with highly infested black oak material where we chipped it in a high-speed chipper, caught the residue, and analyzed it with a microscope, and we did not find any live western oak bark beetle or larva that had survived a high-speed chipper. And the reason we say that also, just real quickly, this is a pupation test we did years ago where we took live hibernating larvae out of black oak trees. We separated them into the level of pupation they were already under, whether they were still folded or whether what we call compressed or no eye color or complete body color. And we put these live larvae very carefully into these cardboard tubes, buried them in sawdust, and then monitored the timing it took for those different life cycles to finish pupating and come out. But the disturbing thing we found was in the jar that had the folded larvae, which hadn't begun any pupation yet, we found that those larvae were able to chew out of that tube, and they came out into the sawdust. And this picture you see here is of a pupating larva that is pupating in the sawdust outside of its pupation chamber. So yes, this was in a controlled setting in my garage, so it might not count for the real environment. Ants would most likely find these things and then out in the forest, but it just shows you that it just takes a small bit of protection and larvae can survive. And some other findings we found, just to go through this pretty quickly, canyon live oaks, canyon live oaks and also black oaks have very thin bark, and sometimes the larvae will pupate and hibernate in the bark, but we've also found direct evidence of larvae that have decided to actually plunge down into the sapwood and hibernate in the sapwood, not the bark, and then they chew their way out, creating the same D-shaped exit hole, but they're not in the bark. And this is a canyon live oak. This is one from a California black oak, and it can make some problems for firewood management and how you choose to treat trees, whether just stripping off the bark might not be enough to control hibernating larvae in these two species. There's a larger piece that shows the number of exit holes that we found just on one piece of wood from a black oak up on Palomar Mountain. And so that all being said, there's plenty of need for further research and things to always be studying new material. This is a plot we have in Julian where we have some expendable trees that are slated for removal over the next 3 years. So we're using them as guinea pigs for a variety of tests. Here we're practicing some chiseling, and we're going to cut these down in a year or two and dissect them and show how the tree heals from chiseling methods. Most of our chiseling methods you don't necessarily need to do, because if you already know the signs of GSOB, it's obvious, and chiseling is really more just for confirmation of very high level trees. If you know the subtle signs, you don't really need to chisel into the tree that much to find what you're looking for. And here's another area to think about. This picture to the left is a pear orchard that was operated commercially all the way till 1990. There were 0 oak trees growing in this area for over 70 years. And when the client stopped using it commercially, here's a picture in 2025. You can see that oak trees have almost completely overfilled and grown in the pear orchard. And it's interesting to note that all these trees came up from acorns that were brought there, meaning there's no oak trees that drop these acorns. These are brought in by birds, mammals, whatever, and sprung up. And within 25 years, these trees are well on their way to establishing a thick forest. Oops, sorry. But at the same time, right on the fringes of this forest, are still to this day areas with very hot GSOB with amplifying trees. These areas that are circled have much, much, much older trees that were there for years before, and there's still GSOB there. And we're only just now starting to see some of the larger trees in this orchard show some early signs of GSOB, but the younger trees definitely survive a lot better. And just a real quick thing, watering trees. It used to be years ago, the theory on your oak trees, was always don't water your oaks. You're going to promote root rot. And while that is still a concern and should be taken into account all the time when you're dealing with trees out in the natural environment, the bottom line is if you have an oak tree and it's exhibiting signs of serious drought stress and it doesn't have GSOB or anything of that nature already going on, your tree is more likely to die from drought stress after the attack of the western oak bark beetle than it is to die from root rot if you were to decide to deep water that tree. The way to think about it is in our environment, when we get a 2 or 3 inch monsoon rain in August or September, all our oak trees don't start dying from root rot. They actually improve and hold on to their canopy longer because it improves their hydration coming into the winter. But it has to be done properly. You have to know the right areas to water and how much to water. Just a quick rule of thumb. If you have a tree with a 50-foot diameter canopy, that root zone is going to receive 1,200 gallons of water from just 1 inch of rain. And 1 inch of rain is considered the minimum, basically, that it takes to start actually hydrating a tree. Half-inch rains, quarter-inch rains, they don't really do a whole lot. They're not that effective. But when you get up over an inch of rain, you're talking about something the tree is going to actually really benefit from. So if you're actually thinking about watering a tree, you got to be planning on putting down a lot of water. So it's not always practical, and you got to really make sure you determine if that's right for your situation. Trees that have GSOB obviously can be saved. This is a tree from Oak Grove that originally, when we started the process, originally had serious canopy thinning. It had about probably first or possibly second year GSOB. There was one exit hole we found on this tree. The client decided to take aggressive action, both spraying and doing even fertilization. And they also did deep root watering for a number of years and also did proper pruning and removal of dead wood. They put a lot of effort into saving this tree. And this picture is from a few years ago. This tree still looks great and its canopy is improving. So there's, definitely hope for, saving trees. So I'm just about wrapping it up here. I'll make this really quick. Some simple answers from what we have learned. Can you find GSOB in the first year? Yes. Can you keep a tree free of GSOB, future GSOB? Yes. Can you control a major outbreak quickly? Yes. Can you save a tree with low to moderate GSOB? Yes, but not always. Can GSOB return after you stop spraying? Yes. Can you save all trees with GSOB? No. Do you need to spray all trees? No. Are there other methods that can work? Absolutely. And continuing research is always important. These are just the findings of things that we have tried and what we've compiled that hopefully people will be able to use some of that information to make correct decisions. And from those decisions, here are some key points for success of your GSOB program. Early public awareness, both public and professional, meaning the public's one thing, but you also have to make sure that the professionals that are out there doing your inspection really know what they're looking at. I've many times had people misdiagnose things and get it wrong, and it's not GSOB, so this is very important. Early detection and mapping, so you can make the plans needed for proper treatment of infested areas, and then the following accurate follow-up inspections are probably one of the most critical things after you started any kind of program, so you can monitor where things are and pay attention to where they're showing up early. So that basically is in a nutshell, kind of what we've been doing for over 15 years ago now. Obviously, I've dumped a lot of material on everybody, so I'll answer as many questions as I can. But if you have any any things that's going to need a longer explanation, feel free to call me anytime and we can discuss anything you may have. If anybody out there who's listening has information that they know that is different than what I have presented, definitely call me and let me know, because what I am presenting is just what I've experienced, and everybody has their own experiences in life and may know something different, and it's always good to pass on new information. So with that all being said, I'm going to bow out and pass it on to Dr. Scott.
Great. So Bret's given you a whole lot of details. I'm going to try to pull back now and talk a little bit about what you may be experiencing and how these outbreaks and GSOB also to relate in management, but from a much say more woodland perspective rather than the perspective of the trees. So if you're at this meeting, if you're listening today, it's probably because you've been confronted with the loss of oaks that you probably thought was one of the most stable parts of the ecosystem you're managing, or the ranch you're managing, or whatever. It's really shocking to see a tree this size die, because it's really kind of an uncommon event. And you're not alone in this. Oaks are icons of persistence in California landscapes. In fact, there's a British proverb, people say it's from the 1600s, that says that oaks grow 300 years, they rest for 300 years, and they die for 300 years. Our trees do not live 900 years in California. But if you substitute other numbers, you can sort of get this feeling that they really become part of the landscape, almost like the hills themselves. And it's going to take me a second to get onto this. What's happened is with GSOB, we've gone from a relatively low level of mortality across our landscapes of oaks to really high levels of mortality. And just to make this comparison, I apologize, this is a 9-year-old slide now, but if you look in the 1930s to about 1996, we were seeing 2 oaks per 1,000 per year die in most of our systems. When you looked at the worst years of drought, that number goes up maybe by a factor of 1.5, maybe twice as bad. When we started seeing GSOB mortality, we started seeing 90% or 90 times increase in mortality in a given year. So that's something that makes you start realizing that your whole system is changing. So for my talk, I want to talk about 2 things to help you focus on this. That's how fast is your woodland going to change, and what will it look like after the outbreak finally slows down. And in the process of doing that, hopefully explain things you need to understand about change and outcome. Bret has covered most of this stuff, so I was originally thinking I might talk first. So Bret has showed you these things, and now I'm going to pull you back and talk about a little bit more understanding on a broader level. So if we look at oak woodlands and then take a cumulative count of the trees that are dying, we don't see that these increases of trees is the same at all locations. So one of the things that's sort of fundamental to try and understand is, when we get these rates of mortality, how come some are relatively slow, in fact, almost non-existent, and then others can be exceptionally rapid, as these 2 curves on the side show. So what goes into these kind of rates of change, because they're different across the landscape? Now, what does this look like? What's the outcome? This is a series of aerial photographs that show you a woodland. This is kind of ground zero in Descanso. So 2002, here's what the woodland looked like. Shift over here to 2009, and you can see what the final level of damage is. There's an exceptionally high loss of canopy, and probably more important is you've lost those areas where you actually have, contiguous stands where you have closed canopy. Now, if we look at this in the situation of Oak Grove, this is one of the hot spots that we found when we started working in this area. So this is one of the initial trees that died about 2014. I'm going to go through a series of images now that will show you tree mortality in each year. I'm going to do this kind of fast because I want to cut my talk a little bit short. But as I do this, you can see more and more trees dying, and this is the actual pattern that mortality occurs over a given year. What we end up with here is about a third of the trees, about a third of the canopy is gone now. And probably the worst part about this is it's usually the largest diameter trees that are disappearing. So you're going from very few trees over basically a 10-year period to where you've lost a third of your canopy. And the 20 to 50% of canopy loss is typically what we're seeing in woodlands across the outbreak area. Now, you're still going to have trees. After GSOB begins to die down, you're still going to have trees present with an increased but not sort of catastrophic rate of mortality in a given year. But your oaks are going to be smaller in structure. There are going to be fewer closed canopy areas. The distribution of the ages is going to be younger. But the trouble is you're going to lose all the big, really specimen trees in your woodland. That's almost guaranteed. Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have oak recruitment, that you're not going to have acorns, because after about 30 years, the trees can start producing acorns again. So you won't lose the forest. In fact, I still say that this is the biggest change in coast live oak distribution since the Pleistocene. However, our oaks will persist. It's just going to be a very different kind of woodland than what you might have had before. And again, there's that loss of those big trees. So how did gold-spotted oakers cause this damage? Bret's covered this really well. I'm going to go quickly through the life cycle. Hopefully you've already seen this before, but big thing is the eggs are laid on the trunk. The small larvae actually burrow down into the cambium, and this dark line here is a cross section of the tree. You have bark on one side, and you have the wood on the other. And the larvae are basically destroying all the growing tissue. So all the tissue that might become bark or might become wood is being destroyed. And you can see a picture of this head on, looking at the surface of the cambium having been absolutely riddled by huge numbers of GSOB. After this, they go back to create these pupal chambers that Bret was talking about. Now, these are really hard structures. They actually change this kind of spongy, undifferentiated bark into a very structured and strong capsule for them to turn into to adult beetles. Finally, they emerge, and we get beetles that are out and flying. And at this point, females lay the eggs again, and that's the life cycle. So really briefly, that's what GSOB is doing to kill these trees. They're destroying the cambium in the way that Bret described for you guys. So, how do oaks respond? One of the things that oaks do is they create callus tissue, and this is mostly in coast live oak, not nearly as much in black oak. But this tissue right here is in response to the GSOB damage. And what this is initially is callus that actually blocks the movements of the larvae in the cambium, and in some cases can control them, but you can actually see that GSOB can go underneath and come out at a different point, and so it's not a perfect system. However, what it also does do, though, is it creates new vessels, new xylem, as Bret was talking about. So xylem basically is wiped out here. You don't get new growth basically along this line. You don't get any new growth in an annual ring. So what that means is you start to see new rings forming here, new vascular tissue. And that's the primary way that our coast live oak respond. Then if you look, about half the trees actually have a tremendous amount of callus that they actually produce. And overall, it's about 50% of the population that do this. So the trees are not victims. They are fighting this GSOB as much as they can. However, when you get a very high number of insects attacking trees, you end up with trees maybe surviving 13 years, but inevitably an awful lot of these trees that are attacked by GSOB end up dying. And that's kind of the crux of the problem. So just to look again at what Bret was talking about where can we attack this issue? You know, the beetles are attacking the trees. How do we respond to the damage? It's really difficult to do anything with the adults. To try to capture the adults, we have no way of luring them, so we can't manage the adult beetles. The other part of this is that we can try to manage the larvae inside the tree, but there's an awful lot of things that are unpredictable, and Stacy will cover this in detail. But when we try to use systemics, it's often hard to know that we're going to be successful, and the outcomes as a result can have very low efficiency relative to the economic and environmental cost. So we can talk about that more. So the spot of management that we come to after 15 years of working with this beetle is the surface of the bark, and it's the only place where we know that the adults have got to lay eggs on top of. The young larvae have to cross that barrier to get to the trunk of the tree, to get to the cambium. And these pupating beetles that eventually are going to emerge have to go through that layer again. So this is our point right now. This is our primary point of management, some secondary management with systemics inside for the larvae. Now, so what drives this difference in the variation in what we see in the rates of these outbreaks and the severity? I was studying West Nile virus when I first started working with the beetle, and human epidemiology have got a way of breaking this down, I think, that's really appropriate for trying to look at GSOB. We're going to look at 5 things. How do they get to the place to actually cause a problem? What trees are susceptible across individual oaks in a woodland that's being attacked? And how basically do the beetles get from one tree to another? Next, and I think most critical to the GSOB problem, what amplifies it so that you get these really sharp increases in the death of trees? And what increases the beetle numbers in some places and not in others? And then finally, how do adults disperse to new locations? And if I don't get to that because we're out of time, that's probably, I'll apologize ahead of time. Anyway, for arrival, it's firewood, folks. And if you don't hear anything else, if you're new, if you don't have an infestation right now, don't import firewood into your area unless you're absolutely sure it's not infested with GSOB. And don't export firewood that has GSOB in it to some other community where it's going to start a new outbreak. So that's how things arrive. Here's a truck working in an area where there's GSOB. Basically, I had no idea where this flatbed truck is going, but it's going with probably 7 or 8 cords of wood. Now, the elements of susceptibility, we talk about what trees get hit. Basically, that's going to have a huge impact. And the first and foremost, we have the age, size, and condition of the oaks and the woodlands. Bret's described this, so I'm not going to go into it necessarily in a whole lot of detail. Drought conditions, he's also described. I may give him a little more of a satellite view of this. And then finally, we do have some trees that are resistant to GSOB because they're hybrids between coast live oak and interior live oak. And this is work that we haven't completed yet, but I have enough initial data to say that yes, hybrids do seem to be able to avoid GSOB damage. So first of all, back to this trees dying for 100 years. If you look at a very old tree, it often has a huge number of things taking place, and Bret's already described that, so I'm not going to go over that again, but there are a lot of things that are going to be attacking an oak tree. Oaks survive, but often they go into decline. Now, why do they go into decline? Well, a young tree has basically a certain amount of wood it's already produced, and then it's got a whole lot of tissue it's going to grow. by the time you get to a tree that's really old, its ability to grow tissue is really reduced. So if you're talking about trying to outgrow the beetles, um, basically a tree that gets old has far fewer opportunities to fight against all of these things that might be attacking the tree and to try to recover from some damage. So young trees, lots of potential to recover. Older trees, not so much. They're already maxed out on their resources, and often that leads to them being more susceptible to GSOB. Finally, Bret has described this. I'm going to show you a long graph that shows drought years. Over here we have the last really big bit of drought, and this is the drought that basically caught Oak Grove, and that it started about 2013, and you can see that a lot of low rainfall years. That leaves the tree susceptible in the ways Bret's already talked about. This is just looking at it from the ground. Think of it like a bank account. We have a lot of rain that comes into the system. It can recharge the system very rapidly. But then if it doesn't rain a lot for a long time, you begin to see the groundwater level drop. And you begin to see that all of a sudden oaks that might have been using the water here are going to be hard pressed to get to the water if it drops to this level. Oaks have deep roots. They really reach reliable water. So it's not necessarily as significant as I've shown here, but you got to know that when you have a drought, your trees are not going to be doing as well. Now, what does this mean for our summer droughts that we normally have? Well, GSOB is a species that's from Arizona. It lives in a monsoon and it emerges in the summer when there's high levels of precipitation. If you look at California, every summer we have a drought. So when beetles are emerging in California, like in Descanso, basically we have a lot of demand, a lot of evapotranspiration, and we have no rainfall coming in. So this is a blueprint to have a tree that can't flux the beetles out as the trees in Arizona might be able to do. The other thing is when you got very low rainfall years, you see that we get sort of a compression of the rings. And when that happens, GSOB is actually able to etch into the vessels enough that it actually can cause trees to die in 1 year, because this is not a very big ring. It's not a thick ring. These are thicker rings. If it destroys the ring, it destroys the vessels, and so you have no way of pulling moisture up into the leaves of the tree. So finally, to talk about the final component of susceptibility, and this is something I've been working on for a while. Turns out that interior live oak has bark characteristics which mean that it's not attacked by GSOB. So we haven't found an interior live oak attacked by GSOB. And it turns out that there's a lot of hybridization between big coast live oak and these smaller interior live oaks. What that produces is a tree that has a certain amount of resistance to GSOB based on the thickness of the bark. So in this case, every woodland, especially as you go further north, you get trees which are hybrids, which may be able to resist GSOB to a fuller extent than the native coast live oak, which are thick barked and compared to these thin barked trees. So now on to contagion and amplification. So that affects probably more than anything else this level of curve. If you look for contagion, how do beetles get from one tree to another? Well, when you have a woodland, this is along the same watershed and about the same location. When trees begin to get spread further apart, the beetles don't seem to be able to find them as easily. There's not as much contagion moving from tree to tree. In these closed canopy, single species woodlands, and this is almost entirely coast live oak, now the beetles have a much easier time going tree to tree. And so the density of the woodland affects how rapidly you can get this kind of spread. So 1 year, this is an area where there's really exceptionally high mortality, but just the next year, in a closed canopy, single species. In other words, there's only oak woodlands here. It's no other species. You can get exceptionally high levels of contagion, of new outbreaks passing from a single tree in 1 year and actually connecting with a lot of other trees. So that's the idea of contagion. Now, amplification means that you have a few trees that can produce a lot more beetles than the woodlands in general. And what we began to find is we would find woodlands where you had very few trees that had a whole lot of beetles, and then a whole lot of trees that had very few beetles. This becomes very important because if you look at from this from a numeric perspective, these trees are creating most of the beetles that are coming out to attack other trees. And I don't know if you can see this. It's blocked out on my screen a little bit, but an amplifying tree is capable of producing somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 beetles when all the other trees in the woodlands may have 10 beetles or fewer. So as a management object, you can imagine that if you can do something with these amplifying trees, you're going to have a lot bigger effect on reducing the adult population that's going to be infesting other trees. So you get a large number of oaks in a woodland, which may have levels that are really close to our native flathead borers. And then you have a few trees which are kind of intermediate, maybe producing 50 to 100 beetles. And then you have these amplifying trees producing literally thousands of beetles. And what that means is that, I mean, this is just an example. If you have 500 oaks that have 5 beetles, that's 2,500 beetles. If you have 5 oaks that have 8,000 beetles, that's 40,000 beetles. So in this example I've given you, each amplifying oak is providing 18% of the adult emergence. And 99% of the oaks are only producing 6% of the adult emergence. So finding these amplifying trees and maybe going back to this other tier of the intermediate trees is exceptionally important in knocking down the adult population. And the idea that 1% of the oaks are providing 94% of the emergence should make you realize that finding these trees is exceptionally important. I want to caveat that by saying that Dr. Vanessa Lopez, when she looked at the reproductive fecundity, the amount of eggs that the females could produce, it's over 400 eggs in some females. So female survivorship and vigor could conceivably swamp some of these things I'm talking about. But again, this is our point of management. If you're going through and spraying a whole lot of trees prophylactically, then you may not be catching necessarily these trees, or you can be catching them. But the important point is that these amplifying trees may be what's driving all of these big, sharp increases and mortalities. And if you have more than, say, 5 or 6 of these trees, and in Descanso, there were places where every tree became an amplifying tree. At that point, you start losing almost all of your canopy. So that's sort of the important thing about amplification. The other point that what makes a tree an amplifying tree? Well, it may be because it's sort of old. Now, what if we have woodlands that have recovered from damage that occurred? And this is a lot of our woodlands in San Diego County specifically, but in a lot of parts of Southern California, where all the trees have recruited in basically the last 80 years. Now you have potentially a bunch of trees which are at the same point in their life, so you can have a lot of amplifying trees. This creates these problems where we have these extreme high rates of oak mortality. And again, this gives you an example. This is 3 years, and almost every tree is infested, and about half the trees are already dead in this particular woodland where every tree is almost an amplifying tree. So that's a way to examine this. I think that some of this, if I give you the structure, you can kind of find your way through amplification and contagion and susceptibility on your own. And Bret's given you all the tools you need, I think, to do that. Last thing I want to talk about is dispersal. This graph shows basically what the problem looked like when we first started tackling it. You don't have to look at anything else except for the beetles themselves are going to move about 300 meters a year to create new outbreaks. But then you have this part of the graph over here where they're moving literally up to 120 miles. And one of the things that happened was Jan Gonzalez,
Tom,
Forest
Dr.
Service, and a lot
Tom?
of other people.
Dr. Tom, can I interject here? We're kind of running up on time here.
I'm
I really
sorry,
want to
yeah.
make sure that we get
Yeah.
time for Dr. Stacy or for Stacy.
Okay.
I hate to be rude here, but I
No,
do want to
well,
get
I'll
her in
just
here.
stop and talk. I'll just
Yeah,
stop.
I'd like to
I'll
get
stop
her in
except
here
for
and talk about Oak
thing I've
Grove
got to
for a minute.
do. One thing I've got to do is, if we look at Oak Grove and we look at the outbreak area, here's the cumulative mortality in the hotspot. Right next to it is an area which was treated. And this is where I think your management options occur. And this is what you should be looking at. And I'll leave you with this picture. This is the area, is the hotspot. It did get some treatment. This is the area that got basically treatment every year. And you tell me what you see across this line.
It's all you, Stacy.
Okay, great. Well, I'm really glad. Well, first, let me introduce myself. I'm Stacy Hishinuma. I'm the regional entomologist for the U.S. Forest Service. Am I sharing in presenter mode? No, I was not. Okay, I think it should be good now. I have I've worked with the Goldspotted Oak Borer for a number of years. I got to work with Tom Coleman pretty close to when Goldspotted Oak Borer was first discovered as the causal agent of all that mortality in like 2009. So I'm really happy to be talking to you all about Gold-Spotted Oak Borer, and specifically I'm going to be talking about what the U.S. Forest Service's management strategy has been and some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. So we use a integrated pest management approach to managing Gold-Spotted Oak Borer, and that is ecosystem driven and also focuses on long-term mitigation of the impacts of Gold-Spotted Oak Borer. So with the integrated pest management strategy, part of the main goal of that kind of strategy is to minimize the risks to human health and safety, effect on non-target organisms, as well as the environment. And so we're using all the tools that we currently have in the toolbox to manage Gold-Spotted Oak Borer to the best of our ability. And I'm really glad that I spoke after Bret and Tom because it really goes to show all of you that when you have an emerging pest and research is in development because this is a pest that has not been a problem in its native range and it's a new problem or relatively new problem in its introduced environment, we all have to stay in communication about what the best tools are. Some of those best tools are coming out, as we speak. And so what I'm hoping to show you is that the techniques that I'm using or that the Forest Service has been using is in line with what Bret and Tom have also been using in Oak Grove and also recommending to others. So these are the main elements of our Gold-Spotted Oak Borer management: prevention, monitoring, using management tools, and reforestation and restoration. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to really focus on the management tools. But the other elements of Gold-Spotted Oak Borer management are equally as important. I'm not really going to talk about prevention, education, outreach, but that's what we're all here today to do. And reforestation and restoration are also equally important and something that the Forest Service is really focused on as well. So in terms of public awareness and education, we have informational pamphlets. We've helped participate in putting up these billboards. And really, I think the key thing here is, even if we, like our national forests in Southern California have done, limit the oak firewood that is leaving the forest in terms of making it not issuing permits and making it illegal for that wood to travel outside the forest, there's still going to be spread. And so we also focus on training and coordination with other agencies, with landowners, in order to spread the information and also make sure that everybody is on the same page and we have a coordinated effort across landscapes. For monitoring, monitoring is also very important. We established our monitoring protocols pretty early on after Gold-spotted oak borer was discovered, and we've kept pretty consistent to those monitoring methods. Those are outlined in this forest insect and disease leaflet if you want to reference it. You can search for that or you can find it on gsob.org or gsob.org. But we prioritize monitoring in areas where we don't have known infestation and also areas where there are known infestation. And as you can, probably surmise from Bret's presentation, monitoring and knowing what the health or the condition of the trees are helps inform what your management is going to be. So we found that these three, and actually one more indicator, are what is most telling for us to know what the impact of gold-spotted oak borer is, and also to see what our best management options are for individual trees. That is tree species. You heard about the gold-spotted oak borer having preferences for certain oak species that grow here in Southern California, coast live oak, canyon live oak, California black oak, and they also have preference for larger trees. So trees over, in general, like 15 inches diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet off the ground, like kind of like the size of a tree that can't wrap your arms around. And then also the condition of those trees is also very important. So Bret was showing you pictures of the crown of an oak tree and how if the crown is thinning out, that might be an indicator of what the health of the tree is. There's not a direct one-to-one correlation between the amount of gold-spotted oak borer damage and the amount of thinning on a crown of a tree of any of the susceptible species. And that's because the crown thinning is just a measure of the overall tree health and not necessarily just gold-spotted oak borer damage. So the other thing that we use to indicate what the past damage at least is for gold-spotted oak borer is the emergence holes. And we count the emergence holes, and you saw some pictures that Bret showed where he actually circled those holes. And when we're following trees year after year, we're circling those holes every year as we go, usually with paint pens. And the reason the crown rating or the crown thinning and the emergence hole rating is important for us to track is because once trees are either show an unhealthy crown or have a certain number of past emergence, so they have a certain number of emergence holes, then they might not respond as well to treatment with insecticide. And they also might help inform us of whether or not we should remove those trees, like if they're amplifier trees, like Tom Scott mentioned. In the Forest Service, we have a little bit of a different strategy for monitoring than maybe a smaller landowner or homeowner might have, because we're managing hundreds of acres of oak woodland just in Southern California alone. So we really have to prioritize our surveys in areas that we can actively manage. So our surveys where we're looking at individual trees and following them over time are really only in areas that we're going to actively manage. And those site types kind of are reflected here: recreation sites, administrative sites, and near roads. That doesn't mean that we aren't monitoring on a larger acreage. So we also have long-term monitoring plots that we follow over time. And those long-term monitoring plots help us inform how we're doing our vegetation management and also just how we're increasing the health and resilience of those oak woodlands. And just as an example, if a forester is writing a prescription and just has a prescription to remove a certain percentage of oak trees that are over a certain diameter, knowing that the gold-spotted oak borer prefers trees that are larger in diameter, that wouldn't really make sense, right? So that's just one consideration that we would take into account. So going into management, we do rely on mechanical or physical handling of infested wood to help control gold-spotted oak borer. Um, these are some things these are some of the rules that we kind of operate by, that all live trees in infested areas are assumed to potentially contain live gold-spotted oak borer beetles. Um, we are using those exit holes in order to infer current infestation. So even though all of the evidence that we're looking at directly of the beetles without chipping into the bark and looking at the actual galleries of the beetles, we're looking either at, you know, symptoms of the tree being damaged, so staining on the bark or thinning of the crown, or we're looking at past emergence. But the theory is that if we've seen that this tree for some reason is either preferred by the beetles, like the beetles prefer to lay their eggs on them and then they survive to adulthood, or that they have better survivability for whatever reason in that tree. We also um, know that live trees with thin crowns and many emergence holes may not recover even if insecticides are used. And if those trees are assumed to be heavily infested, then removing those trees may also reduce local GSOB population levels, especially in areas of newer infestation where amplifier trees might play a large role in the population levels in that area. So for the most part, when the forests do remove these amplifier trees, it's really matching the standards and guidelines that the surrounding community has decided on, and making sure that there's a coordinated effort with that surrounding community. And then we also know that dead trees may contain live gold-spotted oak borer beetles, and you all might have heard the rule is to season wood for 2 years. If the tree is dead and still standing, I would caution you to start the clock, the 2-year clock, after you've cut the tree. We've had several instances where trees have died. They've been high stumped, meaning maybe like 5 feet of the trunk was still remaining, and this tree had no infestation before the tree was high stumped or cut. There was infestation afterwards because there was still viable bark on that tree and there was still a tree-like silhouette standing there. So start the clock after you've cut the wood. For removing dead trees, again, our strategy, because we have to prioritize, removing live infested trees and removing dead trees, our strategy is also to focus on trees that are a potential hazard to human health and safety. In terms of chemical protection, we definitely have found a lot of success with using insecticides to protect these high value trees. High value meaning trees that either will pose a potential hazard if they die, or in high value areas like campgrounds, administrative sites, near roadsides. We have used for the last 10 years, or the Cleveland National Forest has used for the last 10 years, carbaryl to protect trees from gold-spotted oak borer, and there's been good success. The general criteria that we use within those sites for treatment is that there's a target, meaning that the tree is, within a certain distance of a campsite or a picnic area or a roadside, and that they're healthy enough to potentially be able to survive even with some damage from gold-spotted oak borer if we do the treatment. So more than 50% of that crown has to be intact. Less than 25 emergence holes are found on the tree, and the trees are greater than 15 inches diameter at breast height. And I put a little asterisk there because, these are just general guidelines. And just like with a homeowner, the forests use their own discretion to decide whether or not a tree is worth trying to save or not. There's no guarantee either way. There's no guarantee that a tree is going to be 100% protected. Maybe they may be protected from gold-spotted oak borer, but they still might die for other reasons. And I was looking through the data yesterday on our survivability of the trees, and I did notice that we did have trees that were either removed or they died during the course of our treatment. They didn't necessarily die from gold-spotted oak borer damage, but they were removed because they were posing a hazard to the public. They had rot in the tree, there was root disease, or there were other reasons why the trees might have died. And so biology doesn't really operate on strict guidelines like this. So if you have a tree, for instance, that's like 60-inch diameter at breast height that has 25 emergence holes, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's enough damage, just that physical damage on that cambial layer and within the bark to kill that tree. So just, I think working with somebody who knows gold-spotted oak borer, or can help you make that informed decision about whether or not to treat your trees, you can use your best judgment. We have used systemic insecticides as well as externally applied insecticides. So we've used carbaryl for the most part in all of our treatments. But in some cases, we are using systemic insecticides when it makes the most sense to do so. There's a lot of user error with applying the systemic insecticides because you have to drill into the tree. You have to make sure that it's sterile enough to not introduce any pathogens. And you have to find new drill sites every 2 years. So it is not without issue. The other thing that really kind of stops us from there's two other things that stop us from using systemic insecticides, which are costs. I got an estimate from one of our previous contracts that was about 130 trees for a larger contract. $130 per tree for a larger contract, versus with the externally applied insecticides that could be as low as, I don't know, $30, $40 a tree, depending on how many trees you're treating and how many trees are in the contract. And so that might influence what the price is. And so if you have maybe 2 trees to treat, but you combine a contract with multiple landowners, that might reduce your costs as well. But when we use the systemic insecticides, sometimes it's because there's concern from the public about using those externally applied insecticides, or because these trees are located in areas where we cannot apply that carbaryl because it's close to a running stream, or close to other sensitive habitat. So other key lessons learned. Early detection is always going to give you more management options. I think Bret said that in his talk. Even if you are in an area that is heavily infested, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be monitoring though. You might still have options. You might have, we haven't been able to, there are trends in what trees gold-spotted oak borer likes to infest. But even in heavily infested areas, you still have some trees that either are only lightly infested or get infested one year and then don't get infested the next year. So that if you do individual tree monitoring in heavily infested areas, you'll still potentially have some options, especially maybe on those trees that are coming up in size class. They're growing, but they're a little bit smaller. Sorry, I know I'm kind of running out of time here. Application timing is critical. Consistent application schedule is important. We've had issues in the past with getting licensed and certified pesticide applicators to fulfill our contracts. And so once you push it past a certain timing, because those externally applied insecticides are targeting the beetles. Well, they are targeting the beetles when they are doing their first push of emergence after, after the winter. I say winter like that because Southern California, there's not much of a winter. But you're also really targeting those the beetles that are laying their eggs on the outside of the bark. So if you cannot apply your insecticide until later in the summer or the fall, then that application timing might not make sense for you. And then um, I wanted to mention that, you should find a licensed or certified pesticide applicator if you want to use these insecticides. But it's also important to ask them if they have had some kind of training in gold-spotted oak borer management, or know what the considerations are for a gold-spotted oak borer. For instance, like you might have somebody who knows how to apply carbaryl to the label, but gold-spotted oak borer is not on the label. And so they won't necessarily also know that you are supposed to spray the upper branches. Like branches that are greater than 8 inches in diameter are considered to be also susceptible to having gold-spotted oak borer eggs laid on them and being infested. And they also might not know something about, I don't know, like with the systemic insecticides, they might not know that there is a history of introduction of Botrytis canker into those wound areas, and might not know about Western oak bark beetle. So there are other considerations other than just hiring somebody who's licensed, also having discussions about what those gold-spotted oak borer specific recommendations would be. And if you are averse to using insecticides, averse to using pesticides, while it might be tempting to use some of the techniques that do not include insecticides, like whitewashing, or when we first started researching, there was worm castings that were recommended. There's a whole bunch of other types of things that have been recommended by people in the past that have not been tested by scientists or have not had rigorous research done, and they're more anecdotal, based on anecdotal evidence. I would caution you not to use those, and to use either the tools that we already have investigated, or to investigate things like what Bret mentioned, which is making sure that the trees are as healthy as possible. And that's really the strategy that the Forest Service uses on the majority of our forested land. We're managing the trees because we can't actively manage for gold-spotted oak borer in such a large acreage. We're managing the trees in order to make them the most healthy and resilient to any kind of disturbance. And if you, just like Tom said, there is hope. So this picture right here is a picture of the Descanso Ranger District. That's the first place that gold-spotted oak borer was introduced in the late 1990s. That's many years now, gold-spotted oak borer infestation, and pretty much 100% of these trees have evidence of past infestation, but not 100% of the trees are dead. There are still trees that are living, either that they were, not the most susceptible when the first wave of infestation went through, or they're able to somehow withstand gold-spotted oak borer damage. And so there is hope for trees, even if you don't necessarily want to use insecticides. Using those insecticides is the best way to ensure that they do survive, especially in areas where there's a high population pressure. But if you are averse to that, you can also look into reforesting with either tree species that are not susceptible to gold-spotted oak borer, such as if you have interior live oak growing in your area, or Engelmann oak growing in your area, those are non-susceptible or not as susceptible tree species, oak tree species, or you can plant non-oaks as well. But we are not stopping planting oaks in our oak woodlands on the National Forest side. And I think for me, that's it. I just wanted to put in a plug for the gold-spotted oak borer management story map. And that kind of will walk you through all of the different tools that I kind of talked about today. And also there are little sheets that kind of go over things that you can discuss with your tree care professional or arborist, and things to discuss with your licensed pesticide applicator. Okay, and with that, I will close.
Somebody did ask about Engelmann oaks earlier.
They don't normally even get into Engelmann oaks.
There you
We
go.
don't see them. It's not like the Engelmann oaks are responding to GSOB attacks. It's really rare. And I think there's only one instance where someone's reported finding an Engelmann that had an exit hole that looked like GSOB, and I'm not sure that they ever found larvae.
Okay.
So just all the white oaks are, it's only the red oaks that are really the susceptible ones. And that includes where the beetles are native.
Okay. Somebody was asking about, it was mentioned that GSOB attacks the lower trunk, but how often are they found in the higher areas or higher branches? Anybody?
I can take that one if you
Yeah.
want. Basically, GSOB, you see it start in the lower trunk, usually in the lower 10 feet or so. And then as the level of activity ramps up in that tree, you will find the larva further and further up the tree. We've seen GSOB activity as high as 50 feet up a large coast live oak before.
Okay.
One that's highly infested.
Right. Okay, this one I'm going for use on this one, Stacy. Somebody's asking any information about effects on arroyo toads and carbaryl.
No, but we can't spray carbaryl in any areas that arroyo toad exists.
Okay.
So no, but hopefully that, the insecticide treatments won't affect the arroyo toads.
Okay.
Hey, Stacy, could I just jump in on that real quickly about you guys have looked at the effects or non-effects of invertebrates, diversity and abundance around the spring. Could you just speak real quickly to that? That's an area of concern for a
Sure.
lot of folks.
Sure, yeah, that's a study that Tom Coleman did. What he looked at was soil samples from around the base of trees that had been sprayed with carbaryl, and he looked at the soil living communities of invertebrates before treatment as well as after treatment, and he saw no difference in the species richness, so the number of different types of species, as well as the number of different individuals of those species before and after spraying. So if it's applied correctly, then there won't be a high level of impact on the non-target organisms around the tree.
Okay.
Also,
Hey,
if it's
just real
applied,
quickly, also, Brett, I wanted to get Brett in on this because there's concern about the bees up in the trees too, and that's a thing that people talk about. What about the bees?
yeah,
Yeah, bees in general, based on the methods of spraying, you're not spraying anything on the tree where the bees are going to be doing any harvesting. They're usually out, messing around with pollen and the catkins and things of that nature, but down on the main bark where you're doing most of your barrier spraying, we've never run into bees in that area in a manner where they're going to be collecting product and bringing it back and killing their hive. We've even had instances right in Oak Grove where one particular tree on your property, Chris, as a matter of fact, it has a beehive in the very base of it. And every year I get attacked by those bees when I'm up there trying to spray trees around it. And we have actually directly sprayed that tree with a beehive in it. And we spray it strategically so we don't get material in or near where the bees are active. And for all the years we've treated that tree, those bees are still flourishing and doing fine. And the tree has not had any GSOB. But there again, you got to spray it properly. You got to do the application right. We're not intentionally getting it down near where the beehive is. But like I said, generally, the bees aren't going to be in those areas where we're applying the product to be harvesting anything that they're interested in. So there's very little exposure in that method.
Yeah.
You're more likely to contaminate bees if you have a significant amount of drift that leaves your area and lands on flowers that they're pollinating. And that's also a very rare occurrence if the spray is done properly.
Okay. Let's see. Are there any insecticides labeled for GSOB specifically?
No.
No. Okay. here's just
And
another.
as a result, the sprayers are forced to go with the label that calls for what they call general bark beetle application,
Okay.
which covers all other species that aren't labeled on the label or listed on the label.
Okay. Here's one. Can we expect the same level of success from bifenthrin spray as carbaryl spray?
Um,
No.
in the laboratory setting, there's evidence to suggest that bifenthrin will work as well. But that was those studies were feeding assays and walking assays. So yes, bifenthrin should work, but we have not really field tested bifenthrin the way that we have carbaryl for gold-spotted oak borer.
Can we
Okay.
talk about the cost of bifenthrin application versus carbaryl or insecticides? What about the money, Brett?
Well, bifenthrin is a little bit cheaper product compared to carbaryl, but there definitely could be some issues dealing with half-life and having to respray and things of that nature.
Okay, let's see. So this, Stacy mentioned, for large-scale infestations that keeping the forest as healthy as possible is a management strategy. What methods are recommended for landscape scale forest health management? Oh boy.
That's a long conversation to
Yeah.
have, but I will say that
Mhm.
there is not a lot of literature on how to do that level of landscape scale management for oaks, because generally we haven't really had to manage the oaks in oak woodlands for a lot of the reasons that Tom already talked about, but they haven't really been one of the species that we've had to actively manage as closely as we have conifers. So there is not a lot of literature on it. So I think, when there are oak woodlands, like oak only dominated woodlands, there's not a lot of information. So I can't give any recommendations right now, but I would be happy to have those kinds of conversations with you, Matt, if you want to continue that offline. And I can tell you some of the things that we have considered and some of the things that we've written into recommendations for the national forests.
Okay.
Just a real quick little tidbit on that same note. If you're talking about a managed tree, like in a landscaped area, some of the number one things to keep that tree healthy is going to be, keep the leaf mold and organic matter around the tree if you can. Try not to rake it up unless you absolutely have to for, fire issues. Try to reduce soil compaction in the root zone. Those are all things that will give your tree the best chance at staying healthy, and then keep an eye out for early drought stress.
Okay. So looks like the rest is Yvonne saying, so really necessary to remove amplifier trees if GSOB likely to be present in higher branches than able to be sprayed. Some people thanking us for today. So with that, I want to thank all the folks that are still online. I know we've lost a few. People got stuff to do.
I just wanted to mention there's a comment here that summarizes these great presenters that we have here. And somebody in the comment says, amazing, intensely informative presentation, really top notch. So that goes to Bret, that goes to Stacy, that goes to Tom. Thank you guys.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Well, I appreciate everybody listening. It's
yeah,
important to get the right information out.
Absolutely. Let's save some
definitely.
trees.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you guys again. Everybody have a great weekend. It's beautiful weather. Get out and look at trees. Go hiking. Find some oak trees. Go look at them. Get up close. Hug them like Stacy said.